Welcome to Helping Organisations Thrive. Today I have the pleasure of Keith Jackson on the show. Good morning to you, Keith.
Good morning, Julian. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thank you for coming on the show. You are a Chartered Director and an Institute of Director, UK Director of the Year, and you've got more than 30 years of experience leading change as a CEO, Director and Advisor in a range of diverse businesses. And today we're going to be talking about change. We're going to talk about cultural change and that whole journey an organisation goes on and how that happens and what the advice you could do from your own experience to impart that within the sort of conversation. Before we get into that conversation, Keith, what do you love about what you do?
I think I learned a long time ago, quite early in my career, that it's all about people. And a lot of people say that, but aren't quite sure what that means to them, never mind to others. I think I take huge pleasure in seeing the organisation make progress. And that's only as a result of individuals making progress. So developing others, seeing others thrive, and seeing them empowered, so making decisions, being actively involved in new initiatives. I think that really, really energizes me. And I think that plays, one of the reasons that is, and that plays to something that's important to me personally, is, we're all work in progress. So actually, we all want to see progress. It's hugely motivating in ourselves and in others and in the team.
Yeah, I think often in organisations, and obviously you've been a CEO of many organisations, that people often forget about that biggest asset in the organisation, that is people. And actually, whatever you do, whether you're going for new markets or you're doing a cultural change, it's the people bit that really matters. And it's great to hear that you have this sort of passion for people, and also that perspective that says, people are work in progress. Because often I think sometimes, I've talked to lots of leadership teams where they spent 6 months working on a project ready to sort of launch to the rest of the organization, and they launch it and they expect everybody just to turn on their head on it, and they go, well, you've had 6 months working on this and they've got like 10 minutes and you expect them to change. And I think it's that perspective, and I think you reassuring of making sure that people are people and people take time to change and transform. And talking about sort of changes and sort of cultural changes, what in your experience, what typically triggers the need for a cultural change in an organization?
Yeah, I think there can be a number of triggers, and they don't always happen in isolation. You might have it might be multifactorial. So, from my personal experience, one of the biggest triggers was actually relocating the business. So I think that can be actually an opportunity, not just a driver for culture change, but actually an opportunity not to be wasted, that you're sort of almost resetting. So I think that's an important one. Clearly a change in leadership, regime change. I think that can be an important trigger. And I think actually just on that, as a new leader in an organization, again, that's an opportunity not to be missed. Actually bringing to bear your vision, your approach, a different approach perhaps, is an important opportunity not to be missed. It may also be that the market has changed, and that's another driver I've seen previously, that the market shifts significantly and you have to do something differently. And that isn't just developing new or improved products or entering new markets or lots of system improvements. That's actually how you interact with your people, because they're the people who are going to get you to that new place. So yeah, lots of drivers, and as I say, quite often you get more than one at a time.
And in terms of culture, I mean, it'd be good to just understand from your experience and your understanding of what you perceive culture to be, and why is it important to have a great culture in an organization, and what is a great culture? I mean, it's a thing people talk about. So yeah, but just good to understand, how you define culture and why it matters to get that right in an organization for success.
Well, I think most businesses have a plan. Not all, but most. And many of those, but not all, are strategic. So it's sort of longer term view. Where do we want to be in? And 3 to 10 years, depends on the size and the maturity of the organization. But to enact that plan, I think you really need to think about how we do things around here, I think is a phrase I've heard many times. So the culture. And it's one thing to have a strategy to deliver your vision, but I think you also need to have a strong set of values, principles of how you behave, how you decide on things that guide your culture and shape your culture. And one thing's for sure, no matter who the leader is, the culture will evolve. So either you can sit back and be passive and sort of watch and see how that evolves, or you can be much more deliberate, which you should be, and try and shape that culture towards something that's aspirational, exemplar. And again, nothing happens without people. So if you don't actively manage and develop that culture, you really are setting yourself up for disaster, I would suggest. It's one of the leaders' most important jobs, is to shape that culture very deliberately. So yes, I think for me, it's how things are done around here. It's how it feels to be in the organisation. And one thing's for sure, if you're in a similar part of the market selling similar sorts of products, your strategy isn't going to be too different to your competitors. But one thing is absolutely unique is your company culture. And so that is something that you should hold very dear, be very careful and very deliberate about, and get people involved. So culture change for me, it's not just the leader's job, it's everybody's job. And the leader's job is to get everybody involved in shaping the culture.
Yeah, it's interesting because culture can become a competitive edge, can't it, in an organization? It can be a way of attracting good talent, you know, 'cause it's not just about financial, it's about the culture, the feel, the values. And is values the good place to start with developing a culture or looking at a culture of an organization? Is that where we should start? Is how the values are perceived and what it feels like in the organization?
Yes, because they're the bedrock. And I think just building on your comment there, Julian, I think that there's a much used phrase that most people have heard, I'm sure, which is culture eats strategy for breakfast. I think that's evolved. I think culture is strategy. So if you actually have a very unique culture, a very strong culture where people feel part of something important, not only will that help you attract talent, it will help you retain talent, and perhaps even more importantly, get the best out of that talent. People will feel a commitment to the organization. They will want to do their best. They will want to improve. They will want to advance and see the business progress too. So I think absolutely it starts with values, but sometimes they're not articulated in a way that are readily understood by all of the audience, so all employees. So you could almost take a step back from that and say, well, have we got the right values? Or at the very least, have we articulated them in a way that they're really well understood? Have we got too many? I mean, I think, the power of three is a commonly used principle, and that I think should apply to values too. So have we got three non-negotiable, really well understood, really clear values that guide not only our behaviors, but guide our decisions as well? So taking a step back, having a look again at the values and what they actually mean to people and whether they're enacted. And then from that, I think another good place to start on a culture change journey is actually take stock of what does it currently look like? How does it feel to the employees? So an employee attitude survey. And again, experience has taught me that those are best done by somebody external to the organization, completely independent. You'll get much better answers. You probably get a much higher return rate. And importantly, you should share all the findings, all of them, warts and all, with everybody. Say, well, this is actually what our team are telling us. And here's some things that we can work on. And here's some things that are actually really good and we should sort of reinforce and protect. So yeah, I think have a look at the values and do some kind of survey to get a sense of how does it actually feel today and where might we like it to be in 1, 2, 3 years' time, because culture change isn't a quick process.
And from obviously the start place being the values and a sense of when you go into an organization, you can feel whether it's a good culture in terms of people sticking around, engagements, a whole host of stuff that you can sort of get a feel of anecdotally. But what do you think determines what do you think determines or perceives as being a good culture, a place where people thrive? What are the sort of hallmarks of that organization? Because obviously every organization has different culture. It doesn't mean one culture is better than the other. It's just slightly different, isn't it? So what are the key hallmarks that determines that this is a good place for people to thrive and an organization to grow?
Yeah, it's what I call the smell test. So actually having a walk around the organization, seeing how people interact, not just with the leaders, but with each other, how people communicate, how friendly perhaps they are, how open they are, how engaged. So I think that's a really good sign, but actually go and have a walk around. Listen more than talk. That's a really good way of getting a sense of what it actually feels like. I think there are some other indicators as well that are important. And in all organizations, particularly small and medium-sized ones, have to innovate. They have to innovate. And I think you can very deliberately make innovation part of your culture. Now, most people, when they hear the word innovation, much overused phrase these days, they immediately think of products because it's something tangible. Well, actually, there are 10 other ways in which you can innovate in a business, 10 other areas. And one of them, the 11th, a recent addition, is employee engagement. You can be innovative in the way you engage with your workforce. So, and there are many others: profit model, processes, marketing, customer communication. There are many facets of how you can innovate. It's not just about products, but I think that's a real good hallmark of a business that has a strong culture. Why? Because it tends to be a learning organization. It tends to be an organization that wants to get better, wants to improve, not just the individuals, but the systems, the process, the knowledge, the capability, and make progress. So yeah, there are some good hallmarks of a strong culture, and it's not just about employee retention.
Yeah, it's interesting you talked about innovation, because I'm a real strong believer in that innovation is not just products or services. It's how you go about things, your ways of working, how you navigate challenges, which then sort of ties into that whole learning culture. Because if you're learning, then you're always moving forward, and there's always going to be stuff that's going to get in the way. But it's, for me, that creates that resilient culture. And I think that for me is as a bedrock of a good culture, that an organization that can bounce back, that can navigate difficulties together, which is really important. When we start this journey, so you go into an organization, you've been into many organizations where you've done your sort of smell test, so to speak, and sense there's perhaps a misalignment, or not quite as you expect, or you feel there's a value missing. How have you gone about sort of starting to sort of shift that organization into where you think it should be? What are the sort of key factors that you've done to sort of engage with the sort of workforce on that?
Yeah, well, I think one of the first things is not to have too thorough a diagnosis. So what I mean is, don't try and unpick that too much, because you're probably going to be focusing on the negatives. I think actually sort of take some of the positives and say, well, actually, this is something that works quite well. Let's build on that. I think one thing that it really resonates with me is I was very fortunate about 10 years ago to go on an exchange program. So some British business leaders of high growth companies and some Californian business leaders. And that was to the Silicon Valley area of San Francisco Bay Area. And we met some exemplar companies. We went to LinkedIn. We went to Google, some others, Berkeley University, Stanford University. But the big takeaway from all of that very intense trip was all of these exemplar businesses very, very deliberately worked on their culture. Constantly. It's a moving feast. You have to keep working at it. There isn't a program where you start at A, get to B, and then it's okay. You've got to keep working on it. And that was the biggest takeaway. So I think a good starting point is look at the things that are positive, champion those, celebrate those. That's always start with a positive. I think the second thing you can do is, and I mentioned having an employee attitude surveys. If you have one that's very much more deliberately focused around the culture and how it feels to be there, how do leaders interact? Am I getting some development? Am I involved in things, including decisions? So there are ways in which you can sort of tease out, well, where are the opportunities for improvement? And then I think one of the single biggest learnings is, this is something that can't be led from the top, solely led from the top. You have to involve employees, and a really useful tool, and I've used this in other scenarios as well since subsequently, is a diagonal cross-section of employees. You can call it what you will, but my first example, it was called the culture change team. So actually we had a diagonal cross-section, myself, CEO, we had one other director, we had a couple of senior managers, we had a couple of team leaders from the shop floor, we had somebody from the R&D department. So a diagonal cross-section, people at different levels of the organization, different departments. And these were our change champions. So much written about change management. I'm sure lots of people watching have been through that, learned the tools and techniques. This is a really useful tool, and particularly when it comes to culture change, which is very nuanced. It's difficult. It takes time. Actually having those change champions, not just going to promote why we're doing things and what's coming next, but actually be the eyes and ears in the organization, the listening mechanism to bring that back to that team to say, now then, we've hit a little bit of a roadblock. Oh, actually, so-and-so in the finance department had a really good idea. Is that something that we can implement and take forward? Well, yes, but let's involve them. Let's get them involved in developing and implementing their idea with a bit of guidance from this team. So I think that's a really useful tool. But you've got to start somewhere. So I think rather than kick the can down the road, make a start, even if it's modest, and then a bit like all continuous improvement, just keep chipping away, looking for opportunities. And another important learning is not to do this as a scattergun approach, which my previous comments may have implied, but actually to do it in a more deliberate way. And the easiest model to follow is Maslow's hierarchy. So start at the bottom. All the initiatives and ideas that your workforce might bring forwards, might put through a suggestion scheme, whatever tools you use, start at the bottom level, get that right, and then work your way gradually up. I think that's important too, because otherwise the things like self-actualization, team development, etc., individual development, they won't stick if you haven't got the fundamentals right.
Yeah, and I think, as you say, I like the idea that this has got to be a continuous program. It's not a come in, we've changed the culture, therefore it's fixed. It's an ongoing piece, and organisations you're part of, how does that continue? How do you measure it? How do you make sure you're in line with where you want it to be, and growing it and developing it, and bringing new nuances to that culture as things develop, as the market develops, as you develop as an organisation? What are the practicalities of that as well?
I think you've got to make a commitment, and you've got to tell people you've made a commitment. And by that, there's been examples where the company either has never done an employee attitude survey or hasn't done one for a very long time. And I think two things happen. One, you get some employees who are very hesitant to say what they really think. So either they don't participate, or they do a little bit, they make a few comments, or it's a complete deluge. It's a deluge of all these things that aren't right or need fixing, or some things that are really good as well. And please, whatever you do, don't touch and mess with those. So I think having done that, having opened up the floodgate for people to have an opportunity to speak up, you can't then suppress that. So doing that regularly, it becomes almost a habit. This is what we do every year or every 2 years, whichever is appropriate. So actually maintaining that, making commitment to maintain that. And you will find, in the law of diminishing returns, you will find that actually the less meaty things will appear, but that doesn't matter. The fact is that this is something that we do. This is part of our culture, is to ask, how's it going? What can we improve? And actually, importantly, of course, go and enact some of those improvements so people can see real change that improves their lives, their working lives, not just change that improves the business. So I think that's the most important thing, is you've got to make a commitment, and it should be a fairly regular topic around the board table, which is, what are the indicators? The very simple ones are the easy ones, but that might be employee churn, for example. The harder ones to measure, the more useful ones. So, well, what have we done in the last 6 months to advance the capability of our workforce? So that could be training, it could be learning, more importantly. It could be bringing skills into the business that we didn't have before. So, and what are we doing? What's happening around the board table? What continuous professional development have we all done in the last 6 months? And if the answer is none, that's a real warning. That is a warning sign, because nobody has all the answers. The world keeps changing. Look what's happened in the last 3 years. My goodness. So if we're going to be an agile business, improving our capability, making progress with strong headwinds in a very competitive marketplace, well, we've all got to improve our skills and our knowledge and our experience. So I think, it's got to be that commitment. And as you quite rightly pointed out, this isn't a program that begins and ends. This is a journey that you might start, and you've got to continue.
You mentioned there about obviously making sure that the board are in a continuous sort of learning loop and personal development as well, which for me it also goes to this whole piece of when you change a culture, it's all about role modeling as well. And in fact, role modeling is probably the most powerful. If you've got certain values that you've got, I don't know, I think throw one out as the most obvious one is integrity or something. You've got to make sure that everybody, certainly in a leadership position, are leading with integrity and are talking about that. And that, for me, and I don't understand your experience, is a really powerful way of impacting and changing people, those around you, because they observe something, and not just consciously but subconsciously, and that starts to infiltrate, permeate a culture. Because somebody sees somebody acting with integrity, therefore that's what we do around here, and that's how they're the sort of markers. And I think for me also that consistency piece, because if one day Keith acts with integrity, and next minute the decision comes up and he doesn't act with integrity, then it sort of conflicts, doesn't it, and causes that not so sure around here. So have you found that whole role modeling piece from your experience?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. You have to walk the talk. And I think it's not just modeling the appropriate behaviors. I think it's been showing that you're accountable when perhaps things aren't perfect, because we all have suboptimum days, and we try and keep them to a minimum. We try and keep the duration of that suboptimization as well to a minimum, but we're human beings. So I think one of the things that I do regularly, and I've learned is important, is any new employee, it's all very well giving them the pep talk or giving them the employee handbook, and it talks about the company values. Actually, I think it's much more important than that. It's critical that you need to invest time. So every new employee, I have an informal chat, cup of coffee, very informal, and I warn them, or perhaps not warn them. I put them at ease by saying this is going to be a very informal chat. We're just going to have a chat about the company values and what those actually mean. And obviously, I'm always interested in where they've come from and whether they had values and whether people lived them, or whether there's any examples where people didn't live them. And I think that's the important lesson. It's not just being that role model, and we can all be role models, all of us in the organization, but actually what happens when something doesn't go to plan, when we don't follow our values for whatever reason. We've got to be held to account. And so I always end that conversation with new employees by saying, what would you do if you observed somebody in the business who wasn't following our values? And I get a range of answers, but they're broadly along the line of everything from, well, I reported to HR, to I would feel uncomfortable, or I would tell my colleague. And I say, well, what about talking to the person who's demonstrated that behavior that we don't feel is appropriate? What about just having a conversation? It doesn't have to be conflictual. It could be, oh, that's interesting. I'm not. Does that actually work with our values? Is that right? So you can ask questions rather than it be confrontational. And I said, you can do that with me, and please do. If you observe me doing something that you feel, and it's you that's important, if you feel doesn't align with our value set, please talk to me. I'll be really interested. I'll listen, and I will reflect. And then I will go and modify my behavior. And if you can do that with a CEO, you can do it with anybody in this organization. So we've got to hold each other to account. That's really important. Yeah,
I really like that. That's that openness with that accountability piece. Have you had anybody come up to you and say any sort of challenge you in that sense? I'd just be interested over your career.
Well, yes, I have, but I think that's healthy. As I say, we're all human. So
no, I wasn't. I was just thinking that as somebody who's almost been brave enough to sort of go, Keith, you did something I wasn't so sure about there.
Yeah, absolutely. And not just about myself, but about maybe things that are happening in the business. Because as I say, I think the important thing about values and to have a really strong culture, they're not just about behaviors, they're about decisions as well. And I think that transparency, that openness, which should be the default, it should be a very short list of things that we unfortunately have to keep a secret or exclusive. I think the vast majority, the default setting should be share information, share knowledge, share what's going on. So I think there are occasions where people have come and been, and I don't think they have to be bold, I'm hesitant to say bold, but they have come and spoken to me and said, well, is that right? I'd like to understand better this decision that was taken, because how does that align with our value set of X or with Y? And there has been the odd occasion where somebody said, well, they've asked about me. Well, and I said, well, the conversation is actually very easy because I don't mind being challenged. And I think that's another trait of a good leader, which is you are open to constructive challenge. You don't get defensive. You're interested in why that person sees it that way. So you're inquisitive. So I think to answer you, the short answer to your question, Julian, is absolutely. Yes, absolutely. And I think that's part of the leader's role. You have to create an environment where that's okay. Because if nobody comes and stops you in the corridor, and nobody comes and sticks their head around the office door or speaks to you when you're making a coffee, if nobody does that, that's very telling, because you're not approachable. You're certainly not as approachable as you think you are.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of organisations, or leaders, I should say, pay a lot of lip service to this and perceive themselves to be open or approachable until they get challenged, and then they don't like it. And I guess what you're talking here, you're talking about creating a psychologically safe environment where people feel they can challenge, they can put the hand up, they can take risks, because there's a risk in that as well. But just generally, if you talk about innovation before, you need to be able to take risks, and you need to be in a place where things don't work out because you're innovating. It's okay, as in you're not going to be sacked for it. You're going to be challenged to say, what did you learn from that? Can you do something different next time, type of thing, which I think is really important, isn't it? Just going back to the annual survey sort of piece, is that a good enough exposure of understanding at that point in time what's going on in the organization? Because I had a guest on a few weeks ago who does more pulse surveys, which are a bit more, I suppose I would say, more dynamic, more on the go type of thing, or more immediate, and assessing an organization. Just want your thoughts on that, really, because I think it's sometimes those annual surveys, a lot of energy goes into them, and it's a point in time, and it might miss certain other points that perhaps need to be measured. I don't know.
And that's a very good point. I think an annual survey is the minimum. But you're right. You can actually have a sort of a pulse survey on a particular topic, actually, if you're trying to get under the skin of that and understand it better. But I think surveys are one tool, one communication tool, one listening piece. But there's nothing that beats actually having a conversation. So it may be that there are individuals, and again, using the principle of the diagonal cross section, that isn't just a team that's working on deliberate culture change initiatives. It may actually be a focus group, and so actually bringing a group of people together for an informal chat about, well, how's it going? You might have a few questions you want to ask, but just see how the conversation flows. So that's a really good tool as well, because if they have psychological safety, if the leader has created the environment where it's okay to speak up, to actually voice the some obtuse perhaps perspectives, some interesting questions. If that's okay, then you will have a productive conversation. And the important thing is the leader needs to shut up and listen. Let the conversation flow. Not be the dominant voice in the room. That's terrible. So you're right. You can augment an annual survey with lots of other things, lots of other listening tools that are giving you information about, well, how's it going? What's working well, and where have we got opportunities to improve?
Just looking ahead in terms of the future and into sort of 2024, what do you think are the challenges for organisations, and how should they sort of face these from a cultural point of view in their organisation?
Well, yeah, there are a few interesting dynamics at play, aren't there? And there's a lot of discourse about it. So in no particular order, and perhaps starting with the biggest issue, which we've got a very different, we've got generation gap. So Generation Z and how we engage with our younger workers has to be different. Very different expectations, very different approaches. So you've got to innovate in the way you engage with your employees, particularly the younger generation. So that's one issue. I think people, if I think back to my father's generation, people tend to have one job. A lot of people had one job for their career. People of my generation, I'm at Generation X, probably have one career. A lot of people have one career, but different jobs. I think we've actually come to a point now where there's a generation who want to have multiple careers, so very different careers, very deliberately through their working lives. So you have to engage differently. So I think that's an important dynamic. We can't ignore the economic headwinds and the cost of living crisis. So again, that might make people less loyal to organisations just out of necessity. So again, it keeps coming back to a couple of things, which is that sort of continuous improvement, including the culture, making it a great place to work where people really enjoy coming to work. They have a real strong sense of purpose. They're doing some good. And I've been very fortunate to work in medical products and medical equipment for a large part of my career. There's a really palpable sense of purpose. Whatever you're doing every day, you're contributing towards improving patients' lives. So that has a real strong sense of purpose. So it makes my job a little bit easier in that regard. So I think, yes, there are a number of dynamics. And again, I think listening, if the world is more uncertain, if change is happening at a faster pace, we've got to get our listening skills tuned, our antenna longer, because we've got to be more agile. Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned purpose, and I think that becomes a bigger piece, isn't it, in people's lives, not only knowing their individual purpose, but also knowing that an organization has got something bigger than just profits and sales and growing. Actually is adding value to community, to society, and doing something good. And I think that's becoming more evident as when people start to choose. Certainly the Gen Zs are very much aligned that way, but I think even in Gen X as well, it's people wanting something purposeful and meaningful. And it motivates people as well, rather than just salary and other benefits. It's far bigger. Just come to end now, Keir. I really appreciate your insights. It's really been sort of helpful and sort of valuable as well. If people want to get in touch with you and want to connect with you, what's the best way of doing that?
Well, probably the starting point is find me on LinkedIn. So if you search me on LinkedIn, my profile is Keith Jackson 1, so I should be easy to find. More than happy to have further conversations, to share some of my experience, and importantly, to learn from others as well. That's always been part of my philosophy.
Well, thank you for your time today. Much appreciated, Keith.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. It was great to share some of my experiences. Thank you, Julian.